Hey y'all, it is now 2026, and that means that deltarune is tomorrow. So, I gotta make a big standout theory before Chapter 5 comes out and proves everything we thought we knew wrong. If Jaru was able to have Oberon Smog be at least half correct, then I gotta come up with something original to call my own. I have covered other theories in the past, but none of which were my own original theories, just my spin on them, except for one. One very small detail, one single line of dialogue that hints towards something potentially very big. By itself, it doesn't mean a whole lot, but rather, this theory can be used as evidence for other larger theories. Let me show you this funny line that you probably laughed at once and then never thought about again.
Coming straight from your house. Coming straight from your house. He's the one. The king of. He's groovy and never gloomy. You can't get this from an egg.
This funny haha line from Tenna's introduction, I believe, has a much more hidden meaning. Eggs in deltarune are very, very interesting. If you are here, then I assume I don't need to explain to you about the hidden eggs in each chapter. You know of the literal Easter eggs and the Forgotten Man, and have probably heard the theories about how the eggs represent Chris's trauma. Well, I believe this to be so, and I believe that Tenna is not only aware of the eggs, but also by proxy aware of the Forgotten Man. Tenna, in this moment, is telling Chris, hey, you don't need to worry, you can have so much fun here in TV World, don't worry about your past, look at all the cool stuff here, you can't get this from an egg. But if Tenna knows about Chris's trauma, then that can mean only one thing. Whatever the incident was that we can assume is the reason that Chris is working with Carol and the Knight had to have happened right here in the Dreamer living room in front of Tenna. We know that Darkners have knowledge of the world around them and have a history with Lightners even when they just get created for the first time. I guess it is technically possible for objects in the TV world Dark Fountain to have been in a Dark World before, like Tenna and Ram, but I see it more as a last Thursday-ism situation. Although the Darkners were only given life when the fountains opened for the first time, they are given life with a history and relationships with the other Darkners and Lightners based on how the Lightners interacted with said objects before the Dark Fountain was opened. Ram has a close connection to Chris even though the fountain just opened, and that's because Chris played with Ram as an object for years as a kid, and that object still had that same connection when exposed to a Dark Fountain. So I believe that the incident, whatever it was, whatever caused Chris to work with the Knight, whatever they promised not to forget, it happened right here in the Dreamer living room. Okay, that's the theory, bye! No, but seriously, that's the theory. It's not a lot, but this does give us some things to work with. If the incident occurred inside the Dreamer house, then that narrows down what our options as to what the incident could be. This can be used as evidence for many a theory. Hell, Azrael's dust likes this idea. If Azrael is dead and killed by Chris, then one of the most likely places for that to have happened was in their own home. Just like that one other quirky Earthbound-inspired RPG with a lot of similarities to Deltarune. But I believe that the incident was not the death of Azrael. No, I believe it was something else. Something that has to do with someone else. You see, right now this theory is in a weird middle ground that doesn't have a whole lot of evidence. I have the strong initial evidence. I think that Tenna witnessed the incident, and I also have a strong conclusion, but this middle part right here lacks the most evidence. But what I have to go off of is the simplest, most generally accepted conclusion that the community has come to. Whatever the incident was, it resulted in the disappearance of December Holiday. Whatever it was Chris's fault that Des went missing. This is why they are working with Carol and the Knights. What did Chris do? Why? That part I don't have much evidence on besides speculation. But even though I lack specific details, Chris somehow caused Des to disappear into the depths or the Dark World, something along those lines, right here in the Dreamer house in front of Tenna. First, let's go over the how. It is possible that the Chapter 3 Dark Fountain was not the first time a Dark Fountain was opened in the Dreamer house. Look at where we are at the start of Chapter 3, this weird area similar to the intro of the school closet Dark Fountain. Now, we don't know who made that closet dark fountain, but it is entirely possible that it was Chris. If that is the case, then we can assume that these Chris-made fountains have this weird area not like anywhere else in the themed Dark Worlds. When we talk to this person behind the curtains in TV World, we learn that Tenna is the one who made this Dark World all fancy and TV. So without Tenna, it would just be this empty nothingness with all these dust piles and these things, just like the start of Chapter 1. One theory that I like is that dark fountains aren't really dark worlds. They are rather the darkness from a quote-unquote real dark world appearing into our own. Think of it like a balloon. You puncture a small hole in it, and air slowly leaks through. And the Dark Worlds are like that, small instances of darkness peering into our world, and the true Dark World is more similar to these areas rather than the themed Dark Worlds. This ties into what Ralsei says in his initial reading of the prophecy, that the dark and the light need to be balanced and not leak into each other. And maybe Chris is able to make dark fountains more connected to the real Dark World because of their increased experience with dark fountains. I don't think Chris needed Queen's explanation at the end of Chapter 2 to learn how to open up dark fountains. I think it was more so for our understanding as well as Susie's. Because I believe, somehow, Chris opened up a dark fountain in their living room before, using that knife that they always keep on them, and Des somehow got lost inside said dark world. And another piece of evidence for this is what Tenna says right before you play Raise Up Your Bat. "Oh, Chris, remember December? Oh, that little musical prodigy. Blah blah blah, this part isn't important. Heck, maybe you could get her to come back and watch again sometime." Awkward pause. Haha, just kidding. Tenna 100% witnessed what happened to Des. He saw her get taken into the darkness of the Dark Worlds, but not in the way that many of you are thinking. And before I explain that, I have to try to explain a motive for why Chris would try to hurt Des like this. Now, it could just be an accident, but it could also be more than that, and we know that Chris is a bit of a prankster, so this could have just been a prank gone wrong, or maybe something more malicious. What if Chris was jealous that Azrael was spending all of his time hanging out with Des instead of them? What if Chris was jealous of Des being a better musician, given how Tenna describes her as a musical prodigy? Or maybe Chris learned piano in the first place to try to one-up her. What if Chris tried to make Des go away so Azrael would spend more time with them instead of with Des? Now, this isn't a super convincing argument, but what I do find convincing is what comes next. When Des got lost in this darker than dark world, I believe that her soul was split from her body. Her soul was trapped in the depths, in the code, and the Roaring Knight's body is Des's body without her soul. Take all the evidence for Death Knight, the look, the attitude, the bat, everything that makes sense for Death Knight makes sense for this theory. But what happened to Des's soul? It is that voice in the code, lost to the depths. But there is someone else who is also lost and shattered across time and space. And that person is W.D. Gaster. Gaster is the one who created the device that created the connection for us to be in Deltarune. And I think that this device is basically the Goner Maker sequence. It was some way to create a vessel, likely so that Des could have a body to put her soul into, but then someone cuts off the sequence. Someone who probably is Carol somehow hijacks the Goner Maker and sends Des's soul back to her world. Yes, I am saying that the soul that we play as is the soul of none other than December Holiday. Now you might be thinking, that doesn't make any sense. The soul is a human soul, not a monster soul. And to that I say,
are you sure about that?
I checked, and the only direct mention of the soul being a human soul is this prophecy panel, and we all know how malleable the prophecy panels are. There is one other mention though, and it's this. When inspecting these pillows, the flavor text says it's a heart or human soul shaped pillow depending on your opinion. Now, this doesn't mention our soul specifically, and given what we know, this statement could also be true. This is also what human souls look like, but that doesn't mean that our soul is a human soul as well. Both can be true. Now, there are two more times the soul actually is referred to as a human soul, but both are unused. The first is in the unused version of Ralsei's tutorial. The actual version in-game specifically does not say that the soul has anything to do with being a human. It instead says this. And the other instance is in the stats screen, in as far as I can tell, an unused title for Chris in Chapter 1. LV1 human, body contains a human soul. Now, I don't know if this appears anywhere in-game. I couldn't find anywhere where it actually shows up. So it turns out that is actually used. Right when you get to the Dark World, before you even meet Ralsei, before you do anything else, because after you meet Ralsei, that's when you turn into leader. Right at the start of the Dark World, human body contains a human soul. But this is actually the only time in the entire game that the soul is directly referred to as a human soul. But I think that the rest of this theory just fits so well that I have to find some way to justify this. And I might have? I think that the multiple mentions of Chris summoning a demon could be responsible for this situation. Chris, and also Caddy probably, might have summoned a quote-unquote demon, who in reality was just Des' soul from inside the depths. And then Chris absorbed Des' soul the same way that souls could absorb other souls in Undertale. Meaning that although Chris's soul is a human soul, it also has a bit of December in there too. Given the description of souls in the library, I think it's possible for Des' will to exist in her soul, even if it has been absorbed by Chris. I think both of them are sort of connected together in this soul. Funnily enough, this possible explanation gives this theory ground to stand on no matter what the true nature of monster souls actually is. If monster souls function basically the same as in Undertale, where monsters are weaker than humans, and humans are significantly more powerful, then Chris just simply absorbed Des' soul. If it turns out that all Lightner souls are relatively more equal in power, meaning that human souls are not significantly more powerful than monster souls, unlike how it is in Undertale, then the soul that we play as is simply just Des' soul / consciousness inside Chris's body. I remember a scrapped idea Toby had for deltarune, and I couldn't find the source for this, but I remember seeing it, so if you know the source for it, then please let me know. Originally, all the Lightners were going to be humans that turned into monsters in the Dark World. You know, they took his hand and went to a world where everyone is their persona without me. They didn't even think to bring me along. But if this was the original idea for everyone to be a human that turned into a monster, then that would mean that humans and monsters weren't as different as they are in Undertale. And I think it's safe to say that in the world of Deltarune, human souls and monster souls aren't as different as they are in Undertale. So the soul isn't powerful because Chris is a human. The soul is powerful because of, you know, the plot and, gesture. So the soul doesn't have to be a human soul, but why do I think it's Des' soul? Well, I think the most damning evidence for this is the lyrics to Raise Up Your Bat, a song that probably was written by Des herself. So let's take a look at the chorus, the part of the song that plays Lost Girl motif, and the only part of the song that Ralsei does not change. Come follow me into the dark with your heart as the arc which shall shine you the way, because I'm with you in the dark world with your heart as my mark which shall guide you the way, because I am the soul controlling you, guiding you through the game. Des is the soul. And there's a lot more evidence for this, especially relating to Des Knight. Look at all the similarities between Chris and the Knight, the similar poses, and the fact that both are knights. And I think it's important to note these similarities between the Knight, who is Des, and Chris, who is being controlled by Des. Because when Chris takes out the soul, they move around very differently. They aren't stoic and cool. They are, for lack of a better term, freaky. This walk is way more fitting of the Chris that we learn from Noelle and Rudy, a weird loner prankster kid. The way Chris acts when controlled by the soul is a lot more similar to Des, you know, the coolest kid in town, great at flirting, and has a somewhat romantic connection to Ralsei, who is somehow connected to Azriel. Now, I always found the options to romance and flirt with Ralsei kind of out of place, given that we're supposed to be his sibling, kind of. But if we are instead the soul of Des and not Chris, then I think this is a lot more fitting, as there is an implied romantic connection between Des and Azriel in the past. So this sibling flirting isn't actually sibling flirting, it's Des rekindling her lost love. On top of that, the soul is red, and so are the Knight's special attacks. The red slashes against Tenna and the red slashes from these two attacks, I think it's safe to say that in the same way that Susie is pink and the same way that Ralsei is green, Des is red. She also has a red jacket in her closet that many fanarts depict her with. I think that her primary color is red. And come on, you are always welcome here anytime. In red, the color that represents Des, I think it just fits perfectly. Also, the Knight's damage numbers against Tenna are red, the same way that our damage numbers are the same as the colors of our party members. Another small addendum to this, there might be multiple people on the phone in the Roaring group chat. The white text here is most likely Carol, given how she shows up after the white text voice says, "I'll be right there." but some of the text from the phone is in red, and is worded in such a way where it might be a separate character. Given the fact that Chris and Carol would be in communication with the knight, it only makes sense for the knight to be in the same Discord group chat. And if the knight is Des, then it would make sense for them to also have their text be red. A different text color will signify a different speaker, so it would just make things more clear, and it also would make more sense to tie Des to the color red. On top of that, Chris and Des share even more color similarities. When Chapter 1 first came out, a popular theory was that Chris was actually just this universe's version of Kara or something similar like that, because, whoa, evil knife, red eyes! Frisk had red eyes when they were possessed by Kara, so that must mean that Deltarune takes place post-genocide in the New World or something, because we gave our soul to Kara and look, they're here and evil. But no, they are literally not possessed here. The soul is taken out of their body and they still have red eyes. Chris just has red eyes. And in the Dark World, Chris's main color is blue, with red-ish accents. The pink cape is arguably close enough to be red to be counted here, but it's mostly their red eyes. Chris is blue with red accents. And if Des' appearance is anything like the fanon designs, then her main color is red with blue accents. And if she looks anything like her mother at all, she will have some amount of blue on her person, which would even more tie the connections between Chris and Des. And one final Des' red connection, the guitar. Yeah, it looks orange, but the game calls it red. The item that is the most connected to Des in the entire game, even though it doesn't look like it, it is canonically red. I think Des is too connected to the color red to ignore. Also, Des is probably the singer of Don't Forget. The lyrics follow a similar motif of being with you in the dark as Raise Up Your Bat, so the connection of Des being the soul that's with Chris in the dark, it still fits. The song also has a female singer, meaning that the singer probably isn't Rossay or Azriel. The singer just fits Des perfectly. Now, there is one very large and very weird elephant in the room. If the soul is Des, then why would they ever do the weird route? And to that I say, why would Frisk ever do the genocide route? The soul is meant to be a vessel for us to interact with the world of Deltarune, but in a diegetic way. What made the meta-narrative of Undertale so good is the fact that even though this is a world that runs on literal video game logic, with some characters being aware of things like stats and resets, they never outright acknowledge the fact that they are video game characters in the same way characters like Monica or PO3 do. They live in their own world. They are still real to them, but they just have a higher understanding of the world that they do live in. Flowey would talk to you about not resetting the game after Pacifist to let them live their lives, but he never outright states, "This is a video game!" And I think that that same logic can be applied to Deltarune. Even characters like Gaster, who appear to have a higher level of knowledge and level of being, they still never cross the line and realize that they are fictional characters in a fictional world. Why does Frisk do the genocide route? Because we want them to. But in-universe, they're being controlled by Kara. Why does Des do the weird route? Because we want to do the weird route, but in-universe, it's because, maybe potentially corrupted by the device, she tried to do anything to escape, anything to break the prophecy, anything to try to make Noelle as strong as possible to help free her from the depths. Now, minor trigger warning about sexual assault, but I think that the main reason why the Chapter 4 weird route scene was changed is because although you can make the sexual assault metaphor, that is 100% not what the scene is going for. It is an example of December's tough love, acting like her mother, doing anything she can to make the story about herself and her sister, and getting her sister as strong as possible so she can do anything she can to free herself from the depths. Now remember, Chris is 100% against the weird route, and if Chris had a disdain for Des, like I theorized, and made her go missing on purpose, it would definitely make sense for Chris to beat up the soul after this scene, in a way that just doesn't make sense if the soul was saved as a real soul. Chris does not like Des, but that doesn't mean that Chris hates Des. Chris cares enough to try to make up their wrongdoings to Carol, but not when it goes this far. Not when Des is corrupting Noelle in this way. This is Des acting more like her mother than her father, acting in a very cold way to get what she wants, and at the end of the day, she just wants to be freed from the depths and return to normalcy. And if it turns out that time loop theory is also true, it would make more sense for Des to try some extreme measures like the weird route, as she is running out of options to break free. Now you might say, how does Noelle not recognize Des' voice through the soul? And to that I say, souls probably just sound different. We know that Noelle notices Chris sounds different when possessed by the soul in the weird route. She feels that it has a distinctive voice, and that voice is the voice of Des and not Chris. But she doesn't recognize it because it's not a literal voice coming from a real person with a real body and vocal cords. It's a weird, intangible thing, and not her real sister in person. I think that's why it sounds different. Anyways, this has spiraled a bit out of control, so let's recap. Tenna witnessed the incident that caused Des to get locked into the depths, her soul separated from her body, her soulless husk moving around as the night, and her powerful boss monster soul being lost to the depths until Gaster created a device to connect it back to Chris. But then, who was the Forgotten Man? And what do the eggs mean? Gaster doesn't like the eggs and sees them as an issue given the PlayStation achievements. I think I have a good idea for the metaphor that this represents. Eggs often can symbolize childhood in media, and it makes sense. Eggs are literally where baby chickens come from. The hard outer shell hides the inner yolk. Wait, the hard shell and the inner yolk? Oh my god, the eggs represent Des. Before the cooking challenge, Tenna says this. As you and your brother pretended the chefs were bungling the simplest parts, damn, I overcooked the water. Oops, no, I keep breaking the eggs. Oops. Breaking the eggs, huh? Removing the yolk from the shell? Okay, so who's the Forgotten Man then? I don't think that the Forgotten Man is Gaster. In fact, I think they are enemies, or at least have opposing goals, as the man gives you the eggs, while Gaster sees the eggs as issues. And honestly, I don't have an answer to this. The Forgotten Man is an interesting case of what I like to call phone guy killer. Now, if you're not in the FNAF theory space, let me show you what I mean. In 2014, Five Nights at Freddy's 2 released. Yes, it's been over a decade. Back then, the lore in the series wasn't anywhere near as convoluted. We didn't have the Mimic, the Pizzaplex, Midnight Motorist, or even any named characters, other than our faceless night guards who were void of any personality. The story was just about a series of murders at a kid's pizza restaurant. And in FNAF 2, we got our first look at said murderer. We knew basically nothing about this character at the time, so our theorist brains tried to come up with an answer to who he really was. Given how there were so few characters in the story, our options for who the murderer could be were either A, one of the night guards, B, the phone guy, or C, some new character that we knew nothing about. And a lot of people gravitated towards B because it's a lot more narratively satisfying to have characters be, characters with things we know about them. At the time, Phone Guy was the only real character with any sort of depth, the only one who spoke, and the only character who has opinions on things like their favorite animatronic. With the hindsight of later installments, it turns out that the Phone Guy definitely was not the killer, and we would learn more about said killer in those later installments, which would then fully solidify them as their own character. The reason people thought that the Phone Guy was the killer was to just have any sort of satisfying answer as to the identity of said killer. Saying it's some new character we don't know anything about is a fair but boring answer for theories. And the Forgotten Man is a great example of this. Before chapters 3 and 4 dropped, it was common consensus that the Forgotten Man was Gaster. The Forgotten Man was a weird secret character that could only be found rarely when breaking the game. He was only referred to as Man, similarly to Gaster. He gives you eggs, which represent literal Easter eggs in video games, very similar to Gaster. Both are just weird Easter egg characters with creepy piano music. It made sense to connect the two, and today it still does given the achievements, but given the information we know now from Chapter 3, the Forgotten Man definitely is not Gaster. They are different characters, we just lacked any information about the Forgotten Man to have any reason to think that he was a separate character. We want to connect dots like this, but sometimes we just need more information. All we really needed was to hear him talk. And the first time we got evidence of the Forgotten Man not being Gaster was the hidden Valentine from the Spanton sweepstakes. And people still, fairly so, thought that this was Gaster at the time because, although they talked differently, they still talked in a very weird manner. Now with Chapter 3, we know that this weird way of talking is instead the Forgotten Man, a different character, who talks differently than Gaster, who still talks in his own different, weird, segmented way in all caps, which is a very distinct talking style from the Forgotten Man. I still think we need more information to decipher who the Forgotten Man truly is. All we can say now that he is connected to Gaster somehow, and also connected to Chris somehow, and potentially also connected to Des. So, that is my theory. The incident that trapped Des in the depths happened right here in the Dreamer house with Tenna as a witness. And Des' soul somehow got separated from her body, with said body now running around opening dark fountains, and her soul being what we the player control. The Knight also being a soulless husk of a Lightner could explain how they're able to move around in the light world as well, as normal Darkners cannot exist in the light world. This theory does have a lot of holes though, and I would love to hear what you think about it with either some more supporting evidence or counter evidence in the comments. There are flaws with Death being the soul, but I am 100% confident in the fact that Tenna is aware of Chris's trauma, and he meant what he meant when he said you can't get this from an egg.